Jane Austen, best known for her novels set during the Regency Era. Jane Austen is a well-known author today. However, she received little acclaim during her own life. Her novels critiqued and commented on the British landed gentry around the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. She often explored the role of women in society, and her biting and witty irony and use of social commentary have earned her much acclaim among critics and readers alike. Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775 in Hampshire. Her parents were George Austen and Cassandra Lee, and she grew up with 7 siblings: James, George, Edward, Henry, Cassandra, Frank and Charles. She was the youngest daughter and second youngest child of 8. Due to harsh weather conditions, Jane was not baptised until April 1776 with the single name of Jane. Jane's father served as the rector of 2 parishes, Steventon and Dean. He was from a wealthy family of wool merchants. But as the generations came and went, George's branch of the family were not as wealthy. He met his future wife Cassandra Lee while at St. John's College in Oxford at the age of 16. Cassandra came from a wealthy family, and she grew up amongst the gentry. They became engaged in 1763 and married the following year. Cassandra's father had died 2 months before the wedding. They had a small income, with Cassandra's dowry supplementing much of their income. The family lived in Dean and then Steventon, where Jane was born. Steventon was a valley surrounded by meadows, and her home was open and warm, where the children were free to be completely honest and intellectual pursuits were encouraged. Jane's aunt Philadelphia and her other relatives greatly influenced Jane's future work. Her aunt Philadelphia was her father's sister and was a bright, chatty woman who brought light to their rural village and widened Jane's worldview. Out of all her siblings, Jane was closest to her sister Cassandra and her brother Henry. During her childhood, her father also farmed and taught a few boys who boarded at his home as well to supplement his income. Jane would attend church, socialise with family and friends, and read novels aloud to her family at night as a child. She would sometimes read her own work aloud to them as well. Balls were held regularly in the assembly rooms in the town hall, and Jane loved it. She adored dancing. In 1783, Jane and Cassandra were sent to Oxford to be educated by Anne Colley, but they were soon sent home when both girls caught typhus. Jane almost died from the disease. From then on, the girls were educated at home until they were sent to the boarding school at Reading Abbey Girls' School in 1785. They were educated in a number of subjects, including French, spelling, and needlework. Due to the school fees being too high, the girls were sent home in December 1786. After this, Jane never lived anywhere else that was not near her family. From then on, Jane was educated by her brothers James and Henry. Jane and her family and friends would often stage plays in the rectory barn, and her brother James would write prologues and epilogues for the plays. Most of the plays were comedies, which had a significant influence on Jane's satirical gifts. During her teens, she wrote 3 short plays, numerous poems, and stories. Jane compiled her work she wrote between 1787 and 1793 into 3 bound notebooks, labelled Volume the First, Volume the Second, and Volume the Third. They have been referred to as the Juvenilia. Among these works included her novel Love and Friendship, written in 1790, which mocked novels written about sensibility at the time. In 1791, she wrote The History of England, which was accompanied by watercolour miniatures by her sister Cassandra, who was a talented artist. Around the age of 18, Jane began to write longer, more sophisticated novels. In 1792, she wrote Catherine, but it was left unfinished and the story was later included in Lady Susan. She began to write a play called Sir Charles Grandison and completed it in 1800, after a period of time where she had abandoned writing it. From 1793 to 1795, Jane wrote Lady Susan, a novel unlike any of her previous or future writings, in which the novella's heroine used her intelligence and charm to manipulate people. When Jane was 20, Tom Lefroy, an Irish neighbour, visited the Austen household. He was training to become a barrister. Jane and Tom spent a considerable amount of time together, and she described him as a gentleman, good-looking and pleasant. They were both attracted to each other, and none of Jane's other suitors ever measured up to him. However, marriage between the two would have been impractical, as neither had any money, and Tom was dependent on a great-uncle in Ireland to finance his education. Jane never saw him again after this short period of time they spent together, and Tom would later admit in his old age that he had been in love with her. This encounter with Tom would later influence Jane's own writings, in which every one of her heroines would find romance in life. After finishing Lady Susan, Jane completed her first full-length novel, named Eleanor and Marianne, which would later be called Sense and Sensibility. It is unclear how much of the original manuscript had been included in the 1811 published novel, as the original manuscripts did not survive time. First Impressions, Jane's second novel, was completed in 1797 and would later be called Pride and Prejudice. Like with all her novels, she read this novel aloud to her family and it became a favourite. Her family believed in Jane, and her father started to make inquiries to publishers about her novels. In 1797, her father sent off First Impressions for her to Thomas Cadell, an established publisher. However, it was rejected. After finishing Eleanor and Marianne, Jane started her third novel, titled Susan, which would later become known as Northanger Abbey. She completed it in 1798, and her brother Henry offered the novel to Benjamin Crosby, a publisher. He offered £10 for the novel, or around £860 in today's money, for the copyright. He promised that he would advertise the book, however he never published it, and it remained in his hands unpublished until Jane repurchased it in 1816. In 1800, Jane's father retired from the ministry and moved his family to Bath. Jane was shocked to be told she was moving away from her only home she had ever known, and during her time in Bath, she was unproductive in writing, only making revisions to Susan. During this time, her social life and travelling prevented her from writing much. In 1802, Jane received her only proposal for marriage from Harris Bigwither, a brother of her friends Althea and Catherine Big. Jane knew the marriage would offer advantages to the Austen household. He was heir to extensive estates, and Jane would be able to provide for her family. While she initially accepted the marriage proposal, she later turned him down the next day. It's not clear why, but the most plausible answer is due to Jane genuinely not liking him and not being in love with him. Her outlook on marriage influenced her novels. She wrote of loving your spouse and falling in love as being the most important things to a relationship. Jane wrote but never completed her novel The Watsons, which reflected her own life. The story centred around the lives of an impoverished clergyman and his 4 unmarried daughters. She never finished the novel after her father died in 1805, most likely because the circumstances of the characters resembled her own life too closely for her own liking. After her father's death, Jane, Cassandra and their mother were left in a precarious financial situation. As Jane and Cassandra and their mother had no income, their brothers made financial contributions to support them. Jane and Cassandra and their mother moved to Steventon in 1805 before moving to Worthing. They then moved to Southampton in 1806 and shared a house with Frank and his wife. In 1809, they finally settled in Chawton. Jane would spend the rest of her life there. Her brother Edward offered them a cottage which was part of his extensive estate. Life in Chawton was quiet, and they did not socialise outside their family. As was customary at the time, Jane published her novels anonymously. Writing for women was regarded as degrading to the femininity of women. Through her brother Henry, Jane started publishing her novels. Thomas Egerton published her novels. Sense and Sensibility was published in 1811, Pride and Prejudice was published in 1813, and Mansfield Park was published in 1814. From Sense and Sensibility, Jane made the equivalent of about £10,000 in today's money, which provided some financial independence for her sister and her mother. Pride and Prejudice was an immediate success and received favourable reviews. As she had sold the copyright for Pride and Prejudice, she did not make as much from the novels as she should have. Mansfield Park proved popular with the readers, and all copies that were printed at the time were sold within 6 months. Jane earned the most from this novel. However, without her knowledge nor approval, her novels began to be pirated and translated into French and sold in France. In 1815, Jane learned that the Prince Regent, the future George IV of the United Kingdom, loved her novels and had a set of each of her books in his various residences. He requested she dedicate her novel Emma to him, and though Jane disapproved of him, she could not refuse the request, and the book was dedicated to him. In 1815, Jane moved her work from Egerton to John Murray, a better-known publisher who published Emma and a second edition of Mansfield Park. Emma was very successful and made a lot of money. The second edition of Mansfield Park did not do as well, and so any money she made from Emma was used to offset the cost of publishing Mansfield Park. Emma and Mansfield Park were the last novels to be published by Jane during her life. In 1816, Henry Austen's bank failed. He lost all his assets and was deeply in debt. His brothers, who had money in the bank, also lost vast sums of money, and the family could no longer support their mother or sisters. Jane began to provide financial support to her mother and sister. Around 1816, Jane began to feel unwell. Her final illness is not known, but the symptoms she displayed indicated Addison's disease or Hodgkin's lymphoma. Her health began to decline by the middle of 1816. In spite of her health, Jane continued to work and completed Northanger Abbey, Persuasion, and 12 chapters of Sundition before stopping in March 1817. Jane began to experience difficulty walking and lacked energy. By April, she was confined to bed. Cassandra and Henry brought her to Winchester for treatment, by which point she was suffering from immense pain. She passed away on the 18th of July, 1817. She was 41 years old. She was later buried in the north aisle of Winchester Cathedral. In 1818, Jane's final novels of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published together. Henry contributed a biographical note, which provided the name of the author as well as a biography of Jane. Only after death did her novels become truly popular and have been in print ever since.